And I hope that what I share today is right in line, I think it is, with what this ministry is about. But I will be sharing kind of from my own field or my own discipline. And this is something of my own personal journey on issues of science and faith and how I've gotten to a point of seeing harmony between those two. I do believe that there's harmony between science and faith. And I also think sometimes it's a struggle to get there and to see that. And I want to share with you sort of a testimonial kind of address on how I've worked through that. And, you know, sharing your testimony is an interesting thing. It is sort of limited. It's not the most comprehensive treatment you give of a topic. And there are scientists in the room who could give a more comprehensive treatment of some of the things I'm going to address. But I've also found that sharing your testimony has a certain kind of power in it. Because so often when you experience something and you think it's just been your experience, but you share about that, somebody else is able to say, I know exactly what you're talking about. And they've had a similar experience. And so I hope this will be helpful to others, even though I'm kind of narrating just how I've walked through this, and specifically how church history has helped me, which is not something we might expect to be the area of help for science and faith. But I want to share with you 3 ways that it has. And then actually in several weeks I'll be giving another address, and I'll talk about the 4 greatest testimonies for me personally for the truth of the Christian faith. And more sort of materially what I've gotten to. Today's a little bit more of how I got there. And I hope it would be helpful to someone else. Let me just share a little bit about myself. This is a picture of my family. I'm at that stage where you talk about your kids a lot, so forgive me for that, but I love them too much to not talk about them. That's my son Isaiah, who just turned 4 last week, and I'm going to share more about him in a moment because I'm reading him a book about dinosaurs, and we have some great conversations about that. And that's my daughter Naomi, who's 2, and then my wife Esther, and we're pregnant with our 3rd child coming, so that'll be fun. Baby's due in September. So let me share a little bit about how this whole topic of science and faith kind of got started for me. And it was in 7th grade. I, like most of us do, took a class, I think it was called Earth Science. It was sort of just a geology class, and I was not a great student when I was in 7th grade. I was not motivated at all. But even just barely paying attention and, you know, picking up a little bit here and there, I did feel a tension, as most people do, between how do I put together what I'm learning about in my science class, the Paleozoic era and the Cenozoic era and so forth, and what I believe from Genesis 1. I was raised in a Christian home and went to evangelical churches, and I accepted the biblical account of origins, but I didn't know how to connect the dots between that and what I was learning in my science class, and I wasn't real motivated to try to figure that out. It was just an unresolved thing in my mind. But I did read the book Jurassic Park that year when I was in 7th grade, which is a great book. The book actually, I think, has a really deep message. It's not just a great story, more so than the movies. And Michael Crichton talks about that in the introduction. He talks about how the dinosaurs are really a metaphor for the undisciplined use of technology, and specifically commercialized genetic engineering. And he's basically saying, just because you can do something with technology doesn't mean you should, which is, I think, a pretty relevant thing to think about here 27 years after the book came out. But reading that book made me interested in dinosaurs. And I would, you know, it's a story, but there's a lot of actually education as you go. And I wasn't particularly smart about it, but I just had the basic curiosity that I think most people do. How do you put together what you learn about the dinosaur kingdom and the broader prehistoric world with what I believe from Genesis 1? And I didn't know how to reconcile those two things, but I didn't even know how to articulate the tension. Something just felt a bit dissonant. Do you know what I mean? It just felt, how do they fit? And I just sort of lived for a while with that unresolved. So fast forward to college, and I went to a public university where I had a lot of non-Christian friends. And for my friends, and they were, I remember one of my friends in particular who was an atheist, but he was very kind, and I really respected him, and I loved him. And we still keep up a little bit. But he and several others approached these issues, I think, in the way that a lot of people in our culture do, where it was simply assumed that there's an absolute chasm between science and faith. And the Bible's story of origins was thought to be primitive and outdated. And what I noticed about, as I talked with him, because I really tried to put into practice the advice of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, which is another one of my favorite books. And he talks about trying to see the world through someone else's eyes. And I think really the whole book is about this idea of overcoming prejudice and trying to really taking down the wall between me and the other, whether it's the other tribe or the other person or the other ideology or whatever, and really see the world through their eyes before you disagree, and really understand sympathetically what you're disagreeing with. And I tried to do that with my friend and with several of my friends at that time. And that left, I noticed two things. One was that they didn't distinguish between young earth creationism and Christianity, or at least between young earth creationism and the Bible. And that's one of the reasons I'm thankful for ministries like this, because we're trying to carve out space for another way to look at Genesis 1. But a lot of people in our culture, I think, they go together. You know, the Bible and the universe is 10,000 years old, give or take a couple thousand years. Those are just assumed to go together. And I noticed that for my friends, there was no alternative. It was a complete contrast. The other thing I noticed was there was a sort of unquestioning. It wasn't just that the Bible's story of origins was viewed as outdated. It was that it was absolutely unquestionable that it was outdated. It wasn't even a discussion. It was just, well, obviously. Like, for example, I remember watching an interview with Bill Maher once where he was sort of accosting a Christian, and he just put it like this. He said, 5,000 years ago, a garden, a talking snake, really? It's like that. And it was a sense of kind of like, obviously, we know that's not the right story. We've got to get to something else. And that comment captured the way a lot of my friends felt. And I wanted to try to understand that, but I also wanted to try to help them. And that whole experience, I remember one of my friends, just a sort of sneering comment, like, all Christians who believe the universe is only 6,000 years old, or 8,000, or 10,000. And that whole experience marked me. And ever since that time, I've really developed the conviction that the best way to do evangelism and apologetics, and really the only proper way, is with real people. There's a sensitizing factor that happens when you're talking to someone you love and you care about, because there's this burden to do the Atticus Finch thing and try to really understand sympathetically where they're coming from so that you can help them. And if you're just in the books doing things in the abstract, something is missing there of compassion and of really understanding another way of looking at things. And so that experience motivated me to do the best I could to understand how to hold science and faith together. And that basically led to a period of many years throughout college and then seminary, which was for me right after college, of just reading as best as I could to try to understand what is God saying in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and other parts of the Bible about creation, and what is the best way to understand his revelation through nature, general revelation. And as I went through that process, it was kind of intermittent. I'd read a book, leave it alone for a while, come back and read a book. But pretty early on, I began to feel the weight of the testimony for an older earth and an older universe. And even as a non-scientist, and I went in kind of hoping that the young earth arguments would carry the day, because for going into pastoral ministry, at least in the circles I ran in at that time, it would have been a bit more convenient in a way to land in that camp. But I couldn't get there, and already it just felt very implausible to imagine all of the dinosaurs 4,500 years ago getting onto the ark with Noah, even before I could articulate why. But as I waded through the literature as best as I could, reading a lot of like the Zondervan Counterpoints series books, 3 Views on Creation, Evolution, those kinds of books, and then as best as I could into the science literature, I just began to be overwhelmed by what I would call the mutual convergence of all the different testimonies. And this is how I always felt about the young earth counter responses. So I have many young earth creationist friends whom I love very dearly, but it always felt like it was trying to force it a little bit. And it always felt like, is this really the most natural reading of it? Because with one particular piece of data, you might be able to say, well, maybe this is how you understand that from a young earth point of view. But when you put it all together, it's really hard. And for me, it wasn't the big things that we might think of, like starlight or radiometric dating or the fossil order or drilling into ice core samples or all of those kinds of kind of frontline issues that you might think of in terms of testimonies of age. It came down to the little things for me. Because I just began to feel a sense of arbitrariness that, why would God go to such lengths, seemingly, to deceive us? The one young earth argument that always I wanted to be very careful about was the issue of the appearance of age. And people say the only way to create something is it will look old. If the body of Adam comes along, it's going to look like it's been around for a while, or the wine in John 2 at the wedding in Cana. And I always wanted to be careful with that. I thought, maybe that's right. Maybe it just looks old. But then I began to get into the details. And I thought, well, why would God go to such lengths to give an appearance of age? It feels a bit arbitrary. These are 2 pictures from Wikipedia of the second largest of Jupiter's 53 named moons. The largest is Ganymede. This is Callisto. This is one example. And if you just isolate this point, you could probably find a counter argument, but it's an example of the little details that started to weigh upon me, because it looks like meteors have been smashing into Callisto and the other moons of Jupiter for a very long time, because you've got layers of crater impacts. And I remember thinking about that and thinking, why would God go to such lengths to make it look like you have this historical record on the surface of the moon? That feels pretty arbitrary. I have a tough time accepting that God would do that. And it was little things like that that began to add up in my mind. I remember studying about stalactites, which are those things that drip from the ceilings of caves, and they eventually form structures. A lot of them give great appearance of age. I thought, can you imagine 6,000 years ago God creating the world and making it appear like that? Why would that be the case? Can we trust anything that we get in terms of the testimony within the realm of general revelation? I remember learning about the layers of plankton fossils on the bottom of the ocean and thinking, why would God put them there? Why not just leave them out? And I thought, it's one thing if Adam has a 21-year-old body. What other body would you give him? But it is another thing if you give him 21 years of false memories. Why would God go to such lengths to make it appear other than it actually is? And so I got to a point where I said, okay, it looks to me like the universe is as old as scientists say, and we can accept. I don't need to go back to my 7th grade earth science book and tear out those pages where I was learning about the Cenozoic era and so forth, but we can basically accept that. Now, for me personally, that left me in a place of struggle and angst. And this is the testimonial nature of my address today, because I don't assume that anyone else would necessarily feel that. Maybe there are others who accept a 13 billion year old universe with not a care in the world, and it's not a problem for you at all. But for me, it was a struggle. And the reason was not because of any airtight argument I had against it, like here's why it can't be that old. Rather, it was this feeling of counterintuition. It just felt so weird to imagine that all of human history is this tiny little blip at the end of all of natural history, and it just felt very counterintuitive. So right now I'm reading a book about dinosaurs to my son, and it's a visual guide to prehistoric life, so it's not just about dinosaurs, it's about all different kinds of animals. And we learn about the most bizarre animals that God has created. And I'm trying to help cultivate instincts in him of loving God and knowing God. And so we talk about, isn't it awesome the way God has made our world? This is one of his favorites, because this is an Elasmosaurus, which scientists say lived about 80 million years ago. And he loves this one because of how long the neck is. He thinks, think how long it would take that animal to swallow its food. I think you're right. That's a great, you got to love a child's curiosity, right? This is one of his favorites. It's a Quetzalcoatlus, and it's next to the giraffe there for perspective. It's one of the largest flying animals that ever existed. It's from around the same time, the late Cretaceous period. This is the one he doesn't like. That's a reconstruction of a Gycolopterus, which is basically a humongous scorpion that lives in the ocean. And I remember thinking when I first learned that this animal existed, scientists say about 400 million years ago, whenever I'm in the ocean, I'm always scared of stepping on a stingray. I would much rather step on a stingray than one of these. And you just learn, for me, it helps me to get specific, to talk about that animal, because then the feeling comes up, and this is my son's intuition at 4 years old, and quite frankly, it's mine as an adult. He says, Dad, why did God create all these animals? And I say, that's a great question. Sometimes from children, you get the best questions. And scientists can tell us answers to that. Many of you in this room are very skilled at being able to tell. This is why it needed to be that long, and there needs to be all this diversity and beauty and intricacy and complexity in the animal kingdom. But it still felt very counterintuitive to me, because the question comes up. Here's one example of why it felt counterintuitive. As a Christian and as a theologian, training, studying theology, preparing for pastoral ministry, I believe that human beings are created in God's image and that we're unique from the animal kingdom. And I believe that we are given a unique charge over the animal kingdom of stewardship. In Genesis 1, and Psalm 8 even says we're just a little lower than the angels. And so the question comes up, if we're the image bearers within God's creation uniquely, and if we're the stewards over God's creation uniquely, why did he take so long to bring us about? I remember reading the statistic that if Earth history were compressed into a 24-hour period of time, all of human history would amount to roughly the last 2 seconds, not 2 minutes, of the day. And that's the feeling of counterintuition, especially coming from a church background and theological background. Why so long? And the dark feeling of doubt that sometimes comes up that you have to work with, what if it was random? If it was purposeful, why would it wait so long and then God brings his image bearers into existence at the very end? I struggled with that, and I could understand why, even though I thought they were a bit undisciplined in the conclusions they drew. why my non-Christian friends could struggle with that as well. What has helped me, I'll just give the metaphor I thought in terms of, because I'll come back to this later. Most basketball coaches, I played basketball in high school, most basketball coaches don't wait until the final play of the game to send in the best player. And most musical composers don't wait until the final crescendo to bring in the best instrument. And I remember thinking, so why did God wait until the very end to bring in his image bearers? And that was a feeling, I didn't have an argument. I couldn't say, well, it couldn't be that way. It just felt weird. And I struggled with that. And what has helped me has gotten me to a point where now I look at it and I say, actually, I think the very age of the universe is so far from an evidence of God's absence, one more testimony of his immensity and eternity and glory and power. Church history has been one of the things that's helped me along the way. And though this is not a comprehensive treatment of this, and scientists could say a lot more, I just want to share from my own discipline, church history, 3 things in particular that helped me. First, church history gave me a context for counterintuitive struggle, because I realized this is not the first time in history that scientific discovery has caused the church to rethink certain interpretations of the Bible and certain theological understandings. And there are various examples of that we might give, but I think for me the most poignant is the rise of heliocentrism in the 16th century. And it's poignant for me because a lot of my heroes, theologically, the people I've learned the most from in terms of theology, were pretty tough on Copernicus when he first published his findings regarding heliocentrism. Here's what one of them said, and this is true for Protestants and Roman Catholics. Martin Luther, the great reformer, said, "Whoever wants to be clever must agree with nothing that others esteem. He must do something of his own." This is what that fellow, he's talking about Copernicus, does, who wishes to turn the whole of astronomy upside down. Even in these things that are thrown into disorder, I believe the Holy Scriptures. For Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth. That Joshua story in chapter 10 is one of the most common recourses from the geocentrist reactors. But it wasn't the only chapter and verse they would point to. And there were a lot of people. In fact, John Calvin was even tougher on Copernicus than Martin Luther. His views are a bit disputed on that, and there's a false statement that sometimes is attributed to him. But he did say in a sermon once that those who follow the teachings of Copernicus are stark raving mad and possessed by the devil. So that's not good. It was, now you want to say, well, okay, but that was just right when Copernicus came out. Once Galileo Galilei came along, once these theories had time to run their course, then the church got on board, right? Unfortunately, it took a long time for the church to accept heliocentrism. John Owen is another theological hero of mine who lived a century after the Reformers, among the greatest of the Puritan theologians, and he talked about heliocentrism as built on fallible phenomena, advanced by many arbitrary presumptions against evident testimonies of Scripture. And it's easy to look back on that and think, how were they so sluggish to respond to this change that needed to be responded to? But the fact is, I think we should be humble and admit if we lived at that time in history, it probably would have seemed very counterintuitive to us, for a number of reasons. First of all, they had a weight of church history on their side to which they could appeal, favoring geocentrism, or at least seeming to favor geocentrism. Second of all, they had a lot of Bible verses they could point to seeming to articulate geocentrism. And this is where Owen and others made their appeal, and did it rather bluntly, sometimes in the way that people make the appeal to Genesis 1. It's so plain. And there was this contrast. We choose to believe in God's truth, not man's truth. That was the geocentrist response. It's plain as day. The Bible says the earth doesn't move. In more than one verse. And that was a struggle. I think part of it would have also just been the counterintuitive feeling that comes about from moving from a geocentrist perspective to a heliocentrist perspective, which does involve a struggle. If you believe that human beings are at the center of God's purposes in creation, as we do from Christian theology, geocentrism fits pretty nicely with that. If you move to heliocentrism, you can understand the feeling of, wait a minute, this pushes us out as this tiny little speck in the periphery. To return to my earlier metaphors, just as most basketball coaches don't send in the greatest player on the final play of the game, most artists don't put the most important object in their painting in some tiny little dot in the corner. Most architects don't purchase hundreds of acres of land and then build the house in one tiny little spot and leave the rest alone. And you can imagine, at least at the popular level, at least at the instinctive level, the counterintuitive struggle of moving from a geocentrist view to a heliocentrist view. The problem is, heliocentrism happens to be true. And the evidence for it is overwhelming. Though there are still people today who continue to make the appeal, let's trust God's truth, not man's science. And you can find geocentrists around today, and you can read their books, though they're usually self-published. Most of us, though, today would look back and say, we got it wrong as the church. The Bible is infallible, but not our interpretations. We needed to have greater humility in the way we responded to Copernicus. We rushed the line. And what this whole legacy did for me in my journey on these issues is it sensitized me to a new set of concerns. And it helped me feel the weight of dangers in different directions, because some Christians give the impression that in relation to science and faith, the only, or at least the primary danger is, don't compromise. And that's basically the appeal. The imagery is Christian in Pilgrim's Progress at Vanity Fair. And the thing you do is hold up your shield, bunker down, don't give an inch. And that's faithfulness. And this legacy sensitized me to a new set of concerns, and it helped me not just theoretically acknowledge, but feel the weight of the damage that can accrue when we are only pushing in that direction and we're not aware of the danger in this direction of not accommodating the Bible to science, but assuming the correctness of a certain interpretation that maybe even has some degree of legacy too easily and too glibly, and not really listening carefully to the scientific claim. And there's a balance there that is needed. One of the things that I think is a hallmark of being an evangelical Christian is that we don't just regard liberalism as the only danger, but we recognize that there's actually multiple directions in which we can fall into trouble, and there's a fundamentalist side as well. And there are fundamentalist tendencies and accommodationist or revisionist or liberal tendencies that always accrue whenever you're trying to do theology in our postmodern world. You can always over-accommodate, but you can also always under-accommodate, and there's a sense of balance that is needed in how we sort through things. And for me personally, the legacy of Copernicus helped sensitize me to that and helped me feel that. So that when I went into this issue of the age of the universe, I began to say, let's be really careful. I might think the Bible says one thing, but let me really do my homework. So that's a more methodological issue that helped me as I studied church history. Let me share with you a more material issue that helped me, more to the point. Because for me, growing up in the church, I somehow got the idea, and it might have been my fault, that everybody in church history treated the days of Genesis 1 as 24-hour periods of time until the 19th century. And then in the early 19th century, as geological evidence starts to indicate an older Earth, but then climactically in 1859, when The Origin of Species is published, then Christians began to say, well, we got to find another way to look at this passage. So let's, play fast and loose and try to spin things around a little bit and do what we need to do with Genesis 1 to accommodate the recent scientific discovery of age. And that may not have been completely the fault of others. I might have gotten that impression falsely. However, you do hear this claim pretty regularly from some quarters that basically there's an unbroken consensus of interpreting Genesis 1 until the 19th century. That's not an uncommon claim. Certainly that it's the vast majority view. Actually, in some of those very three views books, you can hear that claim from some of the contributors. So that's common. Once again, church history helped me. And I'm holding up a book here by Andrew Brown called The Days of Creation. And it's basically a historical survey. And it's one of the reasons I think church history can be so valuable is that it gives you perspective and it gives you context. And sometimes the perspective and the context is different than what you think. And what he does is he walks through the entire history of the church, not exhaustively, but pretty thoroughly, and talks about the different views of Genesis 1 that existed. Towards the beginning of the book, one of the things he says is this, that any way the modern reader reads this creation account, that's chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3, is almost incapable of being truly new. It has been studied and interpreted inside out, and the main lines of present-day interpretation run much further back than we often realize, and he gives a number of examples of that. And I want to isolate just one example of that, and that's St. Augustine. He's a figure that I'm currently researching in terms of his doctrine of creation, and there's much benefit to be had for a couple of reasons. One is he was so hugely influential. He was perhaps the most influential of all the early church fathers. He lived in the 4th century. There's an old quip by Alfred North Whitehead that you often hear referenced that says, the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's a hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. But it has meaning. It shows how influential Plato was. It's less hyperbolic to say that the history of Western theology is a series of footnotes to Augustine. He was massively influential. And Augustine had a story, and this is one of the reasons I'm so interested in him, that is very similar to modern people. He basically left Orthodox Christianity for a season because he believed that Genesis 1 was out of step with the most intellectually rigorous beliefs of the day. He became a Manichae. Manichaeism was one of the kind of trendy and sophisticated religions in places like Carthage in the late 4th century. And he adopted their view that they had a very overly literalistic reading of Genesis 1. They thought creation in God's image means a physical representation of God. And they thought, obviously, this is an outdated way of thinking about, kind of like my friends in college. Augustine was swayed by that, and he left the Orthodox faith for a long time. One of the greatest theologians in church history. What brought Augustine back was, in large part, hearing a series of sermons by another influential Christian named Ambrose on Genesis 1, in which Ambrose articulated an allegorical reading of Genesis 1. And Augustine began to realize there's other ways to interpret this passage. And that was a key step in his way back to orthodoxy. Now, Augustine was not an old earth creationist as such, and his views developed throughout the course of his career. But what is striking about Augustine is that there are features of the text that led him to interpret the days as something other than 24-hour periods of time. It wasn't an external pressure. Early on in Augustine's career, he wrote an allegorical work against the Manichaees, and he acknowledged that the days have a historical reference, but then he used them as symbols of all other kinds of things. He saw the days of Genesis 1 as symbols of redemptive history. The first day, he said, is from Adam to Noah. The second is from Noah to Abraham. The third from Abraham to David, and so forth. He said another way to sort of allegorically account for the days of Genesis 1 is as the 7 stages of the Christian life, where day 1 is conversion, day 7 is entering your heavenly rest, and days 2 to 6 are these sort of spiritual disciplines and progress. So we get all kinds of different ways. And for Augustine, and actually for most of the church fathers, the Bible had multiple levels of interpretation and meaning. So an allegorical way of deriving spiritual value from the passage was not at odds with a more literal way of reading it. But when he does come to his literal view, which he published in this massive work called A Literal Commentary on Genesis, he explicitly says the days are not 24 hours. They can't be. At one point he says, now clearly in this earthbound condition of ours, we mortals have no experiential perception of those days which were named and numbered by the repetition of it. These 7 represent those first 7, in other words, our experience of days and the days of Genesis 1. They represent them in some fashion, but we must be in no doubt that they are not at all like them, but very, very different. Later on, he talks about an ordinary 24-hour day as a kind of shadow of the original days of Genesis 1. And one reason he interpreted them that way is because he actually believed, as strange as we find it today, in the idea of instantaneous creation. For him, 7 days was not too short, it was too long. He thought God made everything like that. And the 7-day framework is a sort of accommodation to help people understand how God's creation came about successively. It's an accommodation to limited human understanding. At one point, he correlates the successive days of creation to the angelic knowledge of creation, which is interesting. But he's very much of the view that the Bible is coming down into our level of understanding. At one point he says, the scriptural style comes down to the level of little ones and adjusts itself to their capacity. Now, why did he hold that view? Why did he say they're not ordinary days? There were basically 4 issues for him. The difficulty of God resting on the 7th day, the timing of the creation of angels in relation to Genesis 1, which was a huge issue all throughout the medieval era. People said, if this is the comprehensive account of creation that people say, where did the angels come from? Because Job says the angels were singing for joy at creation. So where do we fit them into here? And they began to think, maybe this isn't the whole of the story. Number 3, the nature of light in days 1 through 3, before the creation of the luminaries on day 4. And number 4, the challenge of relating Genesis 2, verses 4 and 5, to the creation work week in Genesis 1. He said this can't be strictly chronological, reading through verse by verse, because here you get to chapter 2, verse 5, no shrub had yet appeared. Those are biblical and theological concerns that are motivating his view of Genesis 1. And I certainly don't think when we're trying to learn from church history, it's never a matter of perfection that we're trying to adjust ourselves to completely. But I wouldn't think of, a lot of Augustine's views are really strange. And you think, wow, you realize the historical distance that lies between us and he. But nonetheless, there's a legacy here that we can learn from that, again, I think cautions us against the claim that everybody saw this text in one way before the 19th century. That's not true. And in fact, it was complexities within the text that led Augustine to his view. And by the way, he was not alone. In the Andrew Brown book, he talks about Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Didymus the Blind, and Athanasius as precursors to Augustine in a non-literal reading. And then he talks about the propagation of Augustine's view. It was qualified by a later theologian named Gregory the Great, and then it was popularized by Isidore of Seville and Bede, who were early medieval thinkers. And then throughout the medieval era, Augustine's view was very influential, to the point where my own study in Anselm, who lived in the 11th century, at one point he references the doctrine of instantaneous creation as the prevailing opinion. So you see how common Augustine's, and again, series of footnotes, he was very influential. And I think that while that should not be taken as an authority over us in every way, it is valuable certainly to this extent that it cautions us a little bit from assuming that everybody read the days as 24-hour periods of time prior to the 19th century. The historical record pushes against that clearly. Let me be brief on my last point. Church history also helped me in terms of thinking theologically about the doctrine of creation. It expanded my ways of thinking. I'll just give two examples of this. One is that from growing up, I somehow got the impression that animal death is all bad. And therefore, that one of the great issues that comes up between old earth creationists and young earth creationists is not just animal death, but pain, bodily pain, suffering, however we define that term in the animal kingdom, and the whole system of predation, alleged waste, inefficiency, and so forth comes up, and you think, did God make the world like this? And my impression growing up was that basically the young earth way of looking at that is the common one throughout church history, that the world was perfect until Adam and Eve sinned. And the idea that it was good but not perfect is again a recent innovation. Augustine is an example that that's not the case. He uses a great analogy. He says that imagine a layperson who doesn't know anything about, say, cars. He doesn't use the example of cars, but he uses the example of a mechanic's workshop. Imagine a layperson walks into a mechanic's workshop and looks at all the different machinery and starts making judgments about which ones are wasteful and which ones are useful. And he says, if you're a layperson and you don't know what these machines are designed to do, it's really presumptuous to make that judgment. How do you know which ones are useful and which ones are wasteful? And he says it's the same thing when people in our day, or in his day, make that claim with respect to animal pain, animal death, and the insect world. He talks a lot about insects, actually. He would be right in step with my son in terms of his intuitions. You know, why did God make the sea scorpions? And he says, insects are beautiful in their own way, says Augustine. And he says, any one part of creation might seem bad in isolation, but in relation to the whole picture, it's beautiful and harmonious. And he emphasizes, and this is the main thing that I have drawn from Augustine's writings that I think is so relevant today. He emphasizes the need for humility in making judgments of this nature. And I want to read you this quote because though it's commonly referenced from Augustine, it is so relevant to these whole issues that we face today. This is what he said in the spirit of his appeal to humility. Now it is quite disgraceful and disastrous. You could translate those words a little more strongly, actually. Something to be on one's guard against at all costs, that non-Christians should ever hear Christians spouting what they claim our Christian literature, mainly the Bible, has to say on these topics, and talking such nonsense that they can scarcely contain their laughter when they seem to be so wide of the mark. And what is so vexing is not that misguided people should be laughed at, as that our authors should be assumed. This is what happened with my non-Christian friends in college. Our authors should be assumed by outsiders to have held such views, and to the great detriment of those about whose salvation we are so concerned, should be blamed and rejected as so ignorant. Do you feel Do you see what Augustine is saying there? This concern that people hear Christians, as he puts it, spouting off about science when they really haven't done their homework. And then they think, well, that's the Christian view. And how often does that happen? And Augustine is offering a caution that we be very, very careful about the judgments we make about God's creation. In this context, about animal pain, but I think the point here is relevant across the board. To be very, very careful in the way we talk and the way we represent our faith when we're out of our area of training and expertise. The second example is that Augustine broadened my conception of creation, and that's why I put up a picture of a tree here, because he talks about trees. And he had this notion, which I'll just mention briefly, of seeds, that God created instantaneously, but there's seeds in creation. And so Augustine said, when you see the unfolding of something after the initial instantaneous creation, it's every bit as much God's work of creation as it is if God steps in supernaturally. That helped me because I somehow intuited that a supernatural work of creation gives more evidence of God's wisdom and power than a natural work of creation. Do you know what I mean? Like if I thought, well, if God creates a tree de novo in my front yard, then you really see that God is wise and powerful. But if a tree comes about through a seed and sunlight and water and time and natural processes, well, I guess God gets the credit, but, you know, it's only kind of partially his work. And Augustine says, no, whatever the range of causation, all of it gives testimony to God's incredible power. And he uses that metaphor of a seed and a tree pretty regularly. That helped me as well. And it helped me, it rubs against that counterintuition that I've touched upon. I want to bring it to a close in just a moment. But let me share sort of as a way to finish. You know, as I have worked through this, because there's always a personal and I believe a spiritual component to working through issues like this. And as I have done so, one of the things that has helped me the most has been recognizing that counterintuitive feeling is a part of learning. Anytime there's actually a breakthrough in knowledge, it usually involves some level of counterintuition. If you believe in Newtonian physics and then you learn about Einsteinian physics, it's going to feel very counterintuitive. That's why it took a long time to be proven. The idea that time is not absolute is very, very counterintuitive. It goes against what we would probably expect. But it's helped me, and this corresponds to Augustine's appeal to humility, to consider that a feeling of counterintuition is subjective. It depends upon my reference point and my expectations. It's counterintuitive because it goes against my expectation. But what's to say that my expectation is right? And as I have kind of again and again returned to issues of science and faith, tried to understand as best as I can what the science is saying, try to do as best as I can theologically with the whole topic, it's really helped me to consider that once you work through, don't panic when it feels counterintuitive, that's normal. But what you get through, and as you work through the counterintuition, is something more valuable for having gone through it. If you push your way through to geocentrism, to heliocentrism, I hope you don't push your way through to geocentrism. If you get to heliocentrism, you have a little bit more of something to look at the stars with and quote Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, because you understand from a little different angle just how immense these objects are that you're looking up at. I have come to feel that way about the age of the universe. I think for me personally, if you see in the size of the universe a little flavor of God's infinity, I believe you see in the age of the universe a little hint of his eternity. And for me, it is worth it to really be careful and work through things very slowly, methodically, because what you end up at is ultimately, I believe, a stronger understanding of God's role and the feeling of the marvel of God's creation, having really wrestled with that feeling of counterintuition. Is this really God? Knowing that it is that old, that we are just a tiny little blip here at the very end, gives you something so that as you go to Psalm 19:1 and you look at the stars and you realize what you're looking at, you feel it a little deeper, that these stars are an incredible evidence of His glory. They are an incredible demonstration of His handiwork. And I believe church history is one of the tools that can help us get there. So in a few weeks, I'll say more about the broader topic of sort of testimonies of the truth of the Christian faith that have been most meaningful for me. But hopefully this will set that one up a little bit. So thank you for listening.